Well, it's 10:30, actually just turned 10:31. And so that means it's time for brainstorming the human connection with the South Dakota Humanities Council. My name is Lawrence Diggs, and I will be your host and Inquisitor General. So, yeah, today we are going to be talking about missing and murdered Indigenous people. Normally, we talk just about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, but apparently there's at least some men who have been caught up and gone missing or murdered under mysterious circumstances, and that can be a topic as well. My guest is, at least I can't see so far, my guest is, we hope, is going to be Tatewin Means, and she is the co-chair of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Advisory Council here in South Dakota. And I'm hoping, we had a little bit of trouble getting her on and getting her connected, but we will carry on, you know, because there's lots of things and lots of, if we don't have answers, we can raise questions. And often the questions are more important than the answers, because that's mostly what I have anyway, is questions about most everything, really. So let's oh, I have to remind you that this is an interactive program. I need to say that every time, because a lot of times people are very passive, really passive. And that's kind of not quite the way we had it planned to work, because what we're interested in is a conversation. That's what this whole thing is about, is having a conversation. And you, each of you, are part of that conversation, or should be part of that conversation. We would like you to be part of that conversation, because all of us will always be smarter than any one of us, or whatever the subject is. That's been my general observation, you know, wisdom of the crowds, I think they call this. So I'm hoping that you guys will have some ideas to share. So I'm going to start off, actually, while we're waiting to see if Tatewin can get connected with us. Sometimes these things are really tricky and hard to make work. Into this Zoom technology, it can be working just fine, and then suddenly, for some odd reason, it will just crash. So we're hoping that she can get on. So I want to start off with asking all of you a question. And even if you don't answer right now, I'd like you to be able to be thinking about it, and we may come back to that question, but it's one that we can all, oh, look, she's here. But are you live? Can you see us, Tatewin? Hey, wow.
Hello.
You know, I was starting to like think you was a missing Indigenous person. But
nope, I'm here.
You're here. That's a good thing. Good. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. How are you all?
Good. So we kind of got started while we were trying to work out the internet stuff, you know, getting you on. Can you tell us something about who you are first, and then we'll go into a little bit about the council?
Sure.
Tell us some background.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Tatewin Means. I grew up in the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in Kyle, South Dakota. I attended school, like my educational foundation is in a tribal school, Little Wound School, and I'm always very proud to share that because of the misconceptions and perceptions about reservation-based schooling. I graduated from an off-reservation school in Rapid City. I went on to Stanford to receive my undergrad in environmental engineering and a minor in comparative studies in race and ethnicity. I have a law degree with a concentration in human rights law from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in Lakota leadership and management from our tribal college here, Oglala Lakota College. Currently, I am the executive director of Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. We're a grassroots nonprofit organization right in the heart of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Our work extends throughout Oglala territory. Prior to this, I was the Attorney General for the Oglala Sioux Tribe. It's a political appointed position, and so I held that office for an entire term. And anybody that knows anything about tribal politics, that's quite the accomplishment, cannot be removed. And so I made it my entire term, and at the end of that term decided it was, I wanted to be back in the community doing work at that grassroots level. It's really hard to, ignite systems level change when it's these really old archaic systems. And so really found my home here at Thunder Valley doing this work, across our reservation. So happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And, I look forward to the conversation.
We would be remiss if we didn't at least acknowledge that the accomplishment that you have had with Thunder Hill, did you say?
Thunder Valley.
Thunder Valley, that's the opposite of Thunder Hill. In Thunder Valley. That's quite, we should have you back to talk about that if you're willing to, because I think that is an incredible undertaking and lots of things to be learned from just your journey and putting that together. But today we're going to be talking about missing and murdered Indigenous persons. And can you tell us something about the council, how it got started, and more or less what its objectives are as of today?
Yeah, so I was invited to a conversation in Pierre by the interim attorney general at the time, Mark Vargo. He had an interest in having the state of South Dakota take some active steps, some active efforts towards addressing this issue. And so I was invited, and partly because I had built a relationship with Mark when I was the attorney general of the tribe. And so my involvement in that really stemmed from those relationships that I built at my time in that position and in that capacity. And so myself, many others that are working day in and day out on this issue were invited, a lot of grassroots efforts, not even formal organizations, just individuals that are really passionate and committed to this issue. So it was just a roundtable discussion, just getting some input about how the creation of a position, really, not an office or a department, but a position within the Attorney General's office of the state could work with tribal nations, could work with tribal citizens to collaboratively address the issue. And so, we attended that. I felt like it was really a step in the right direction. It was surprising that was the idea coming from a state office. But it was hopeful. I really appreciated the efforts that Mark made, in that short time he was there in the Attorney General's office. And this was in the summer before he was about to leave, right, in that position. And so just informing everyone that there would be a position created, that they were interviewing people already. So that part was already in motion by the time we were pulled into the conversation. And then after they made the selection, Allison Morissette she I had to think about it because we had a conversation with her here at Thunder Valley, and one of our staff members kept calling her Alanis Morissette, the singer. And so now it's like in my brain, every time I'm saying her name, I'm like, no, it's Allison Morissette. And so, she was hired, and during Lakota Nation Invitational back in December, they had, a welcoming of her to the position. Community members were there just trying to really build that communication bridge between, tribal peoples and the state to let us know what's happening. And then they decided to create this council that would kind of be advisory to that position, to offer support to Allison. I mean, the scope of the work is so large, one person can't do it all. And so being able to help her make connections to different groups or organizations that can help push the work forward. So the goal is just to be advisory to the position, to help move the work forward and help to build those relationships with tribal communities. It is a state position, it's within state government. And sometimes those are really difficult to build relationships within tribal nations. Sometimes whenever you talk about those kinds of cross-jurisdictional relationships, tribal nations get really nervous about that kind of thing because of, encroachment on jurisdiction, encroachment on sovereignty. So there's always some hesitancy from tribal programs and tribal governments when the state is doing things in that area. And so they've tread kind of lightly. And I think Mark was strategic about asking certain people to be a part of this effort as a, being hopeful that by seeing different individuals a part of this effort, that it might be safe to support and to work with. So that's kind of the overview. We've had one convening as an advisory group to Allison, but I know she's busy making those connections on her own. She comes from Pine Ridge. She comes from our communities. Her family's from here. So it's not like she's starting from nothing. She already has a solid foundation within our community. So I'm really excited to see what she's able to do.
Okay, so it sounds like even though you call it an advisory council, its active role is as a liaison, sort of an independent liaison in the sense that you guys help them as much as they help you,
Maybe.
Maybe,
I really
okay.
think, I mean, like they're not.
Yeah, I'm not trying to force that definition.
Yeah,
I'm just
I think it's just advisory to her and her role.
Okay.
When she encounters different challenges, just helping her think through and maybe make connections for her when possible. But she's really leading the work.
Okay. Give us some scope now of the problem of missing Indigenous people. Tell us about that. Was there some kind of starting point where you noticed a big uptick, or has it just been gradually increasing over time, or what? It's
always been a tremendous issue. I mean, it's always been a very large issue in scope. I mean, when you think about how decimated our populations are by numbers, how small of a population we are as Indigenous peoples nationwide, this epidemic of seeing our women go missing, seeing our women murdered, started from the point of colonization, if we're honest. That trend of like the dehumanization, the genocide that happened, it started from colonization. And has just continued, and sometimes through very formalized practices. So during the MMIW Awareness Week, which was the first week of May, we had
excuse me, what is MMIW?
Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women.
Okay, so we have to.
So sometimes it's called MMIW or MMIP, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons, and then MMIW is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Sometimes you hear MMIR, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives. I mean, so the fact that our relatives go missing so often, especially in this area. I know when I was Attorney General, the whole issue with White Clay, Nebraska, having the liquor licenses 1 mile away from Pine Ridge. One part of our testimony to the Liquor Control Commission of Nebraska was the unsolved murders that were happening in White Clay.
Mm-hmm.
So, little to no attention is ever paid, in state jurisdictions when some of our relatives go missing. And so, you hear those acronyms kind of being interchanged quite a bit, but it started as an MMIW for women movement. And so we had a presenter by the name of Norma Rendon. She's an elder from our community. She's worked as a domestic violence advocate for many, many years here and throughout Indian country. And she presented on, the history of violence against Indigenous women, and talked about that history from colonization, bringing attention to even the practices of forced sterilization through Indian health services during the 70s. So, at different times, the government has employed policies or practices that have been aimed at women, have been aimed at reducing our populations. And so I don't know how many women were actually affected by that forced sterilization, but it was throughout the Indian Health Service in the 70s. And so you'll just see throughout history over the last several hundred years, our women have really been targeted in that, that violence.
Mm-hmm. So do you have like numbers in the last 20 years? I'm trying to get a scope of like how it's increasing.
I don't have those today. And I think that's something that's a part of the issue. I think that's why a lot of the states now are making more active efforts to create task force, to create offices such as the one that the positions like South Dakota. I know they've passed legislation in other states around this issue because there's no uniform data collection. There's no uniform system to track this information. And so I think that's a part of the issue, is that there's no way to know the numbers.
So if I'm understanding you, just to be clear, at this state, we're not even keeping track of these people who are going missing. It's like an idea that maybe we should, but we have not been actively keeping track of it. And there's no way through all of the missing persons reports over time that people could say, hey, send us your data, and then even if it's not, that doesn't render a particularly accurate thing. Could be a good start. Am I hearing that?
I think it's the uniformity and how it's collected and where it's housed, right? So the issue with data collection in Indian country across all crimes has been an issue because you have federal departments and agencies that collect data, you have state departments that collect data, and then tribal. And there's always a discussion and dispute about who houses the data, where does it go, who has the most accurate information. That's been an ongoing issue. It was an issue when I was Attorney General. So I think the issue is the uniformity and the systems that are used to house the data. It's all over the place. So how do we get accurate numbers in one place? Where do you go for those? And that's where people are saying, well, it should be the state office. Well, no, it should be federal because of the jurisdictional issues. And so it's just, it's up in the air. There's no uniformity.
Okay, so I guess, I hope I'm not belaboring this too much, but it just seems like now that we have like computers, it's not like somebody has to sit down and write all that stuff in. It seems like, well, once anybody has it, you just say, okay, look, here's the file, but I'm hearing that is not the case. And so if you would be so kind as to expand on that a little bit of like, where is the bottleneck?
I think I just did with the uniformity of the issue. So like if you have a task force on child sexual abuse, right? You're going to make some concerted efforts. So for example, I was a part of the Jolene's Law Task Force for the state of South Dakota, which was an effort to end child sexual abuse in South Dakota. Okay, a concerted effort supported by the legislature. From that came the Center for the Prevention of Child Maltreatment, which is going to act as a data repository for information from tribal nations, from state offices and CPS, right? Like an entity that's responsible specifically for addressing child sexual abuse. Okay, it streamlines the process, right? Rather than somebody who wants to know how big is the problem of child sexual abuse, which affects more Indigenous children than any other race of children because of the CPS system, right? So where would you go for that information? Well, you would have to contact the feds for their information. Each tribal nation, there are 9 tribal nations in South Dakota, getting their information. Then you go to all of the state jurisdictions, every county, going to every county in South Dakota. How would you get that data? So the solution there, one solution was, let's create this entity that's supported, and it was through the University of South Dakota, that can specifically focus on child sexual abuse in South Dakota. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Yes, I'm sure you can. If I called Cottington County in South Dakota and said, how many files do you have on missing or murdered Indigenous people? Do you even track that data? Well, going through everyone, and I mean, that's a process, right? So what are we doing? We know this is a problem, it's pervasive. How are we bringing more visibility? I think that's the other part of this, this issue, is the visibility of it. I know on social media, there was a young lady who was white that went missing in maybe Utah, some national park, and it ended up her partner was arrested and all of that. And it was like maybe last summer or a few summers ago. And I apologize for not remembering her name, but it was national news, right? And there was all of these stories and attention. And, you know, a lot of advocates in this MMIW movement are saying, our women do not get that kind of visibility. Our women's stories are not uplifted at that national or international level as non-Indigenous women. And why? Why is that, right? And so I think it's more of, you know, questioning, why aren't our women paid that much attention and prioritized in media, and, you know, and all of those things. So having these concerted efforts by state governments, I think will go a long ways in at least getting accurate numbers, right? Getting an accurate picture of what the baseline is that we're dealing with here. Because I think that's part of the frustration, is we don't really know the scope of the problem, where to focus efforts, if we don't have this like uniform, streamlined data collection system.
Okay, that's a thing to work on, and I appreciate you elucidating that. Betty looks like she has something that she wants to add to this conversation.
Thank you. For myself, I remember when VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, became law. I just found it was in the 90s, but I think mentioning that at this point might help to lay the groundwork for us understanding why there is so little information about the reservation disappearing people, is because it was not illegal. Off-reservation people could come in and do their dirty deeds, and as long as they got off the reservation, they weren't subject to any legal problems. That did change, and so I'm just throwing that in because it kind of helps me think about it, and then wonder if that's why things have been going on so badly for so long.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And you're right, like Violence Against Women Act, you know, some specific provisions related to tribal jurisdictions. So the issue that she mentioned is, it's not that it wasn't illegal, it's just that there was little to no prosecution of offenders when committing acts of violence, non-Indian, non-Indigenous, non-Indian offenders committing these acts of violence in Indian country. Because if you know anything about jurisdiction, this might have started with a whole hour of jurisdiction education, because it's very confusing for a lot of people who aren't familiar with tribal jurisdictions. So at any given time, there are 3 jurisdictions within a tribal nation within South Dakota: state under certain circumstances, federal, and tribal. Federal jurisdiction, tribal jurisdiction runs concurrently. This has been established that they are separate sovereigns through Supreme Court case law. So an individual, an Indian person, could be charged both tribally and federally for the same offense, and it's not considered double jeopardy because they're separate sovereigns. How often that happens? Not very. I mean, sometimes, at least when I was Attorney General, it would be a cooperative conversation with the feds, or whether we would try charge them tribally and move forward there, or then it would be handed off to the feds. And the feds only have jurisdiction under major crimes. So there was a federal act called the Major Crimes Act that allowed the feds to have, this is the FBI, US Attorney's Office, to have jurisdiction over these major crimes, assaults, sexual violence. They've heightened even child abuse to a felony level in certain circumstances. Theft and robbery. So there's certain thresholds of crimes that the feds will have jurisdiction as well. The state jurisdiction applies when it's a wholly non-Indian offense or what they call a victimless crime. Drunk driving, for instance. If a non-Indian person was driving through the reservation, was pulled over, was intoxicated, the tribe cannot prosecute that person because they're non-Indigenous. The state would have to come and prosecute that person. If a non-Indigenous person commits a crime against an Indian person, only the feds have jurisdiction. The tribe doesn't, the state doesn't, because there's an Indian victim. So therein lies the problem, and why a part of VAWA was really focused on addressing that concern and the lack of jurisdiction and protection of Indian women when it came to non-Indian offenders committing these acts of violence against Indian women. And honestly, it's still a concern. The declination rates, the prosecution rates of non-Indian offenders in Indian country is pretty low. I can't explain that. I mean, I'm not a part of that system. I'm not making those prosecutorial decisions. That's a question for the federal prosecutors as to why that is. And that's not every place, right? Like, I'm not generalizing to every US Attorney's Office, but you'll hear those frustrations from Indian communities all the time, that where's the accountability for non-Indian offenders when they're committing these crimes within our boundaries, within our territories. And so what VAWA did is it allowed for tribes to, if they met certain requirements, to be able to prosecute non-Indians tribally. For some, that was huge. It was a huge step forward to, I guess, returning sovereignty to tribal nations, because there's a court case, Oliphant, where basically it says Indian tribes do not have jurisdiction, are not competent to prosecute non-Indian offenders. And so it's like people saw it as one step towards reversing that decision, basically. You have some tribes like the Oglala Sioux tribe that were against piecemealing our sovereignty in that way. The tribal council chose not to jump through all those hoops to get this jurisdiction back. So you have people that feel differently about it, that it's not for the feds to dictate how or to what extent we're sovereign within our own territories. But then you have some that say, well, it's a step in the right direction, so we're going to do it. So it's a bit controversial, but that's the history of VAWA and why those specific provisions were needed when it came to tribal jurisdiction. And the other really important piece I like about VAWA, again, the Violence Against Women Act, is the cross-jurisdictional recognition of protection orders, right? So when a person gets a protection order for their safety in one jurisdiction, before VAWA, you would have to go to other jurisdictions and have that court order recognized, right? Like, so then I would, if I got a protection order in Rapid City, and I then went to Colorado, I would have to get it recognized in Colorado. And then I moved back to the Pine Ridge Reservation, I would have to get it recognized in Pine Ridge. So what VAWA said is it's recognized, there's comity throughout jurisdictions. The victim does not have to go to every jurisdiction and get a protection order, or every jurisdiction and get it recognized. That one protection order will be enforced across all jurisdictions, which is huge. I mean, and that's really important. And I know, the state of South Dakota and the tribal nations have made efforts to make sure that law enforcement are aware of that provision, that they're giving the right information to victims, and they're really protecting victims when they're trying to enforce those protection orders. And so, it is all a part of this bigger conversation about protecting our women. But law is only is as good as it is in implementation. You can have a very well-written, well-intentioned law on the books, but if the people implementing it aren't aware of it, aren't trained on it, or just have a disregard for it, it's not going to be effective. And so I think that's always an ongoing conversation, how well, new law enforcement are trained when they come on about these issues, and do they have the most current information about that? So the training aspect is always important.
Right. So one of the questions we have is, well, I'll state the whole thing. In November of 2019, an executive order was established on the Operation Lady Justice Task Force to address the legitimate concerns of American and Alaska Native communities regarding missing and murdered people. It was under the auspices of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Is that still active, or have you ever heard of that? That was to you.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that. I can't speak to that. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So moving along, hold on a second here. Get back to my.
I have
Oh, go ahead,
question
Vicki.
I'm out in Los Angeles now. I'll be back in South Dakota, but my experience with, I had a tenant. He went missing. And I filed a report. They don't want to hear about it, for 48 hours. There was never any follow-up. The only follow-up, I think he had committed a crime, and some undercover people came just looking for him on the crime. Still hadn't found him a year later. And then I have a relative that has an alcohol and drug problem that would go missing. And then we have so many homeless. And then some people I've noticed in families in South Dakota just have a habit of moving around so much the family's given up keeping track of them. And I don't think there's a drug or alcohol concern. I know that we're talking about people over 18 probably. So with that in mind, and is it illegal for a person over 18 just to go wherever they want? And the other factor in it is if a woman is really in jeopardy and she knows that he will track her down no matter what, she will relocate to the further extent. So how can you tell, like a missing woman that's been harmed, or just somebody who takes off or wanders, or because of drug or alcohol abuse? I mean, you have a lot of people to encompass in this area. And then there's not a lot of police work to enforce it. And other than that, I think they aren't interested. Like out here was my feeling towards LAPD. It was just a minor thing. It was like an inconvenience to take my report. So I can see all kinds of problems with getting figures on who's really missing or in danger. I mean, do they categorize when you file a report that this person may be in danger because of, or they have a habit of disappearing? Is there anything like that in place? There wasn't here.
I think you raised some really good questions, and I think that I don't know the answer to that. I mean, as far as different law enforcement entities, that's a question for law enforcement, a very good question for law enforcement. But I think it depends. I think it depends on their own protocols, how they document that information, how they track that information, and what they consider priority. I don't know. I think it does vary, and not only within jurisdictions, but it varies officer to officer, unfortunately, sometimes. But I definitely, for your very first question, I mean, it's not illegal for people to move freely if they're over 18, with a few exceptions. I mean, if they're under a like the guardianship of somebody because maybe they have mental health issues, that might come into play. But most generally, I mean, obviously people are free to move about wherever they choose. And so I think that's a problem. I think where this issue really comes to a head is with our houseless populations. Like you're saying, like, is there even a care to investigate them, from law enforcement? And I think that's a big challenge. I think it's a big hurdle, especially in and around South Dakota. We're seeing how these city governments are addressing houseless issues. I have my own personal feelings about how they're approaching this issue. And so, but like at a broader level, addressing the houseless issue, I think would do a great deal towards addressing the MMIW, MMIP issue because of, their living circumstances, the kind of support and resources they may need for if they're facing, challenges, mental health challenges or substance abuse challenges, what kind of resources are available in these communities so that they are kept safe. But as far as law enforcement response, that's something that especially now, I'm not able to answer for that. I've kind of been out of that world for a while, but it just really is jurisdictional dependent. But I think that's why South Dakota is creating this position, right? To hear these kinds of things. And then for this position to say, okay, here's feedback we're hearing in the community. So now State Attorney General's office, right? Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state, how can we make these changes and adjustments across all these counties? And there's only so much that office can do, right? There's only so much they can do from that position, but it's a start. And so I think right now is really like the information gathering stage, figuring out what is needed, what are the communities seeing, and then taking that back to say, okay, how can the state of South Dakota address these concerns?
When a woman is missing, let's just say she's missing and she applies for some sort of government help, SSI, food stamps or something like that, do they coordinate with other officials to keep this person, to track this person? Could they work side by side? Let's say there's a report that she's missing and then she leaves and gets some sort of government support, medical support, something. Do they track that so that they can find her?
That's exactly what I was talking about in the intro, right? Where's the uniform system that's tracking this information so that if she goes missing in South Dakota, but then is applying for assistance in Florida, how is that information all connected across jurisdictional lines? And it isn't, right? In a uniform way.
Oh,
that goes back to the first issue of there has to be some uniformity in housing this information, tracking it, and then accessing it, right? How do people here in South Dakota access that information to know, hey, she showed up here, unless somebody's specifically looking to do that?
okay, thanks.
So what is being done at this time? What kind of things, not just with the council there, but in general, is there any movement toward, resolution?
At what level?
Any level. I'm just trying to see is, is there, we got all kinds of things on the table, yes, as far as like issues, problems. Or is anybody doing anything that we can say, oh yeah, there's some movement over here. We don't necessarily know if it's going to resolve the thing, but what kind of things are even being tried or talked about,
Well, the one I can speak to the most is what's happening at a grassroots level in our communities by our own community members, right? So community members really getting educated about search and rescue. So it's hard if a relative goes missing to even get formal search and rescue teams on site helping to look, right? So how do we as community members, as relatives, look and search for a missing relative and not not disrupt a potential crime scene, right? Like, so all of those things are important. So how are we training community organizations? We have a lot of individuals that look for support when they do this work, right? Community members know to call them because they have access to this resource or this resource, but they're not a formal organization, right? So how are we supporting these individuals and groups that are doing this on their own because there's no like broader effort by government entities? So there's a lot happening at a grassroots level. a lot of individuals, communities, families that have been really strong advocates for this, and partly because they've had relatives that have gone missing, sadly, or have been found murdered. So they've taken it up like as a personal mission to do what they can to help others in the same situation. And we can't forget also about like the prevention efforts that are happening across our communities, to educate ourselves, to have healing as, you know, as community members, so that we're not perpetuating the violence in our communities. And so at the grassroots level, there's a lot happening. Whether that gets the attention at a larger scale, that's a part of the problem, right? And so I think that you have individual states passing legislation, like I mentioned, developing task force, but I'm not aware of anything that is uniform across the board. It really is just state dependent. And it's really the states that have large indigenous populations, right? North Dakota, Montana, Arizona, like those that have a lot of tribal nations there, high tribal or indigenous populations, that you're really seeing the movement.
Okay, well, I asked the question just kind of to get the answer that you just gave it. There's some small things that are happening. Hopefully, you know, at least I can see the potential of it eventually coalescing into larger and larger and more coordinated efforts, but that's a difference between, you know, something happening and absolutely nothing happening. So that comes back to, okay, what as individuals, is there anything that each of us can do? What can we do to put some wind in the sails of these grassroots movements? Or are we doomed to be just bystanders and watch it happen?
I think for anything related to our communities, educating yourself is the first step. I mean, I was asked some about history of VAWA. I shared some about like forced sterilization. So understanding the scope of the issue and how it came about is really important. Because once you have that understanding, then that might be more of more motivation to be a part of what's happening, right? Because in educating yourself, you're going to become aware of these different efforts that are local to you, that are regional to you, that you might be able to support. Always supporting legislation when it comes about at the state level, at city levels, to address this issue. You know, citizen support is always helpful. Finding organizations that are Indigenous led, that are addressing this issue in our communities. So supporting them financially as a donor, as a supporter is really crucial because they don't get a lot of attention. And so finding access to that. And I mean, that's one nice thing about having the position that Allison has, is she's making those connections. So she's, you know, developing this ongoing list of who is all working on this issue in the state of South Dakota. Who are the primary stakeholders? Who are the entities, the organizations, the families, the people? And so that's a resource. That's a resource for all of you to reach out to say, okay, if I'm interested in helping, how can I do that? Because there's a person focusing on that effort now, right? Because I get what you're saying. A lot of people say, I want to help, but I don't know where to start, right? So instead of, you know, not having any idea, there's a starting place for everybody now. And that's within the Office of the Attorney General of South Dakota as a good starting point. And so that's a very positive thing by doing those kinds of things, is that citizens, you know, concerned citizens have a starting point.
I would just like to address the possibility and get feedback from you on crowdsourcing searches. Okay, so in other words, if there's a central place somebody can say, hey, this person is missing, and let's say at least they feel that's under mysterious circumstances, we'll put it that way, that's worthy of like, well, let's make sure they're okay. Is there a crowdsourcing source that a person can enter that? And let's say I have a Facebook following, other people have a Facebook following, other people have a telephone, or other people have other ways that they communicate. And if you could drop that in and say, okay, hey, this person looks like this. We think that something's fishy going on here. Anybody seen that person or know of that person, please contact X. Is there anything like that? Or if not, would something like that be useful? Are there problems? Would there be problems with it?
That's been happening in our communities. It's happened very organically, actually, not any formalized process. People just really sharing when individuals go missing. And it's been effective. Sometimes people have been found. I get those all the time in my feed, like for even around Rapid City, are young people going missing, people are sharing, resharing. But it's like, if you're not connected into that community, you're not going to see them. I mean, so
Right.
it is a good idea. And I'm not sure of the solution of how to do that, but how to get that information to a broader audience for the sharing and the resharing and all of those things, because within our communities, it's happening.
Yeah. But it just seems like, as they say, we have 6 degrees of separation. So if there's enough people, or I would use, if let's say if you double the population of people who receive that information, is there a mailing list or an email list or something like that people could say, hey, look, I'd watch out for people, who knows when or I may have something. I just want to know, in case something like that happened. Is there ways that someone who's not on the res or in the loop already could get in the loop?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay, so that's a thing we can think about. The rest of us, we can think about how we might be in the loop. In addition to getting more educated, which is certainly a place we can start. But that might be a thing. Anything else that we as a general population can do? And I'll throw that out to the rest of our esteemed panel here, because this is a conversation between everybody. Any ideas that you have that we can toss out and then see, well, sometimes something looks like a great idea until you think about thing B and you think, oh, well, maybe that could go south real quick. So this is a place maybe we could brainstorm. What are some things that we feel at this point that would be a good thing with minimal drawbacks?
I think awareness. I went back to South Dakota 24 years ago. I was on the Eagle Butte building with Jimmy Carter, and I found everything nice. Just as it was great builds. The environment was good. And then I sort of lost track. I'm back in Seneca, out in the prairie, and I really was unaware. I was unaware of many things. I have seen some really great movements, but I've also seen or heard the drugs and alcohol, the problems. So, and this missing women, Indigenous women, I don't think I knew about that till about 3 or 4 years ago. And I've been there 24 years. So I really had no idea. And I usually get a fair amount of information, but I've never seen any information on my iPad that comes up in news or Facebook or anything that would let me know more information. So the average person that's not on the reservation, that's white and living out in the prairie or a big town, I don't think they know about this. I don't think they really know. To me, it kind of seems like the reservation is kind of in a little bubble. We don't really know what's happening there. We have an isolation, like 2 different groups or something. It happens with other people too. But we just don't know. And so I would say that if there was more press, get people to do more write-ups. I don't know how sensitive the peer newspaper is or some other ones, but get them to write more articles so the rest of the people know. We really, and where I live, I really just don't know what's going on in the reservation. And I try and keep an open ear. I really don't.
Mhm.
That's all.
Thank you, Vicky. Anyone else have any ideas?
Can I respond to that really quick?
Yes, sure.
So no, I think that's precisely right. It's something that I had mentioned early on about the visibility of this issue on a more like regional and national scale. That's a problem. As Indigenous people, you know, our invisibility really presents challenges in addressing some of these really long-standing issues. And it's not just what's happening on the reservations, right? A lot of our relatives go missing stateside in state jurisdictions. And so it's raising that level of consciousness and visibility, even when it's happening within your own jurisdictions. And you're absolutely right, like asking that this be covered more by media, holding your media accountable, holding your law enforcement offices accountable. You know, why when these murders and missing people happen, why aren't we hearing about it local? I mean, those are questions you can ask of sheriffs, right? Sheriffs are elected individuals stateside, like those, they're accountable to the community and the people. And those are really important things to do, is to question that. And that kind of support and questioning and inquiry really goes a long way in helping us bring this attention, you know, at a larger scale. Having non-Indigenous allies raise the same questions we've been asking for decades and decades and decades goes a really long way. I think you're absolutely right. It's something that we are addressing at Thunder Valley with, we hosted a first annual media summit, Lakota Media Summit last October in Rapid City. And we'll be hosting the second annual one this October. It's October 5th and 6th. We plan it right around the Black Hills Powwow. But the intention is to really shift narratives around Indigenous storytelling, Indigenous people in media, so that you know, we have more agency and representation when it comes to our communities. And so that it's not always a deficit narrative. It's not always the poverty and all of those things that you see in the despair, that it's really that empowering, liberating narrative that we really want the broader community to know, but also to raise consciousness about issues like MMIW. And we invite non-Indigenous allies, non-Indigenous media and press to come and to get educated, to learn strategies on how to be more representative of Indigenous issues in their media. And last year we had members of South Dakota Public Broadcasting come, and they you know, shared some really positive feedback of things they've learned there. So we'll be extending those same invitations to media across South Dakota and regional media, hoping to change some of that, so that they will be more attentive to our issues and be more willing to share our stories when it comes to issues affecting our communities.
Mhm. Anyone else have ideas of something that each of us could do, might do? What could we do collectively, individually, however you want to think about that? Because I'm at the solution portion of this program at this point. Looking for some potential solutions. What
I
could we-
would just, good morning. I'd just like to follow up on what Tatewin was sharing. You know, obviously the number one issue is not having the uniformity in terms of the way, you know, this information is reported, but just in a little bit of research that I've done, I've come across several organizations within our state and different, you know, different parts of the state that were created to deal with this issue. And, you know, even at the state level, it would be nice to have maybe a sort of a clearinghouse or a place to go, if you will, where we could find access to all of these different local groups. You know, Tatewin has talked about the grassroots efforts, and of course there's many of those, you know, across the state, but just for those of us who are not closely tied to those efforts, a place where we can go to learn about, you know, what are all those organizations, what are all those grassroots efforts around the state, and be able to find out a listing of those. And then, you know, with contact information, certainly that would be one way that would be helpful. So something that we can take to our legislature, perhaps at the state level.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you, Colby. anyone else have some ideas that we might explore? Maybe not in the few minutes we have left, but if we can just list them, some new things or different things or things you've seen work. Anybody? Well, I think I would just like to move toward what should be done now. Just to kind of recap, I know you, Tatewin, you've mentioned some other things, but what, to recap, what kind of things should be done, whether they're the individual citizens, the government, whatever. It's just so we have a list of those going out.
I see a question in the chat. I guess it was from Facebook on which social.
Oh,
media
okay.
pages
I didn't see that.
should be following. I think there are some more national organizations that are really good about raising awareness and consciousness. Illuminative is really good. They actually came out with a podcast recently around the boarding school crisis, and so Illuminative is one to follow. They have really a lot of good information on their websites, and all of their social media is really active. NDN Collective, it's actually based in Rapid City. It was founded by Thunder Valley's first executive director, actually, Nick Tilson. And so they're a more national organization that really do a lot of advocacy around various Indigenous issues. And so they're a resource. Indigenous Peoples Movement, I just know from like their social media presence, they're really good just about getting information out, sharing information. Those three come to mind off the bat. So I think that would be a really good starting point. And then just, connecting from the types of things they share. I mean, that's just how you can grow your network, who they're sharing, who they're connected with, and then you can see that grow. That's a really good question. Thank you. And to recap, just being proactive in Indigenous history, educating yourself on Indigenous history, especially the Indigenous history of where you live and the land that you occupy. It's all connected. All of the history of Indigenous people, it's connected to the violence that we've faced since the point of contact, the point of colonization. No matter how hard or heavy that history is, we can't have healing moving forward until we have that acknowledgement of that past and the reckoning of that past. And, I always say that what happened to the Indigenous people of Turtle Island is the original sin of this country, of the United States government. And until we're all able to have the courage to learn that, and then to take the next steps forward on how we heal from that. That's something we're actively doing in our communities. How do we heal from that trauma? How do we heal from that history? We haven't been able to so far and that's how you see the manifestations of the high suicide rates, the high substance abuse rates, and all of those things. And so, it's something that's heavy on our minds and hearts is how do we have collective healing? And so having conversations like this are really important. And that's why I really appreciate the opportunity to share, because it is a first step in moving towards our collective healing. We all have to heal from the traumatic history of colonization. All of us, regardless of you're Indigenous or not, like it's impacted all of our lives in really harmful ways. And so I think just having the courage to do that, to face that, is a very important first step. And then being willing to be an ally. That's a conscious choice, right? Making those efforts to question local governments and to ask more of our legislatures and our law enforcement and our media, and being an ally and support in that way. And then also finding Indigenous-led efforts to support.
Thank you so much. We're getting really near the end of our quick hour here. There are so many other things that I would like to cover on this. And I'm really, at this point, personally focused on, okay, well, what kind of structure can we get to coordinate some information, because it doesn't seem like the government's going to do it. But I've seen other kind of examples of where crowdsourcing information has worked where just Joe Blow just decide to set it up and then it takes off. It's solving other kinds of problems where people have just solved the problems themselves because government, religion, et cetera, they're just not interested or whatever. So I'll give some thought to that, and maybe I may have resources to deal with that. I hope the rest of you will also be looking for ways that you can personally put some wind in the sail of people who are trying to bring an end to this kind of epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people. I want to thank you all. Thank you especially Tatewin for joining us and bringing some wisdom to this conversation. I look forward to talking to you again about the project that you're really focused on, or another project that you're really focused on, because you're doing lots of interesting things. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we will see you same time, same station. A quick moment. You can get the chat if you click on those 3 little dots in the box down at the bottom, and when you open up the chat, then you can get a lot of links that Carolyn has so graciously put in the chat. So we'll see you next week, same time, same station.
Hi, everyone.